As of the most recent official count, this summer's heat wave across North America has been blamed for 44 deaths, 29 of them in New Jersey alone, most of those recorded during a single brutal stretch at the start of July. That number has been repeated in headline after headline for weeks now. Here is what almost none of those headlines have told you. According to the researchers who actually study how heat kills people, 44 is very likely nowhere close to the true number, and the reason has nothing to do with hidden deaths nobody noticed. It has to do with timing. A body pushed to its physiological limit by extreme heat does not necessarily fail on the day the temperature peaks. It can fail 3 days later, 10 days later, or according to at least one major American study, months later, from a heart attack, a stroke, or kidney failure that a death certificate will list under an entirely different cause with no mention of the heat wave that set it in motion weeks earlier. This is the part of a heat wave almost nobody talks about, and it is exactly why the scientists tracking this pattern say the real toll of a summer like this one is still being counted, long after the news cameras have already moved on to the next story. This is the story of what actually happens inside the human body in the days and weeks after a heat wave technically ends. Why official death counts like the one attached to this summer's heat. Waves are consistently, structurally too low, and why researchers studying the science behind it say this problem is not a temporary quirk of bad record keeping. It is a pattern that is very likely getting worse for a very long time to come. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the actual published research says. Drop a comment and tell me if you or someone you know has ever had a serious health scare in the days right after a heat wave broke. Because if you have lived through exactly the pattern this video is about to explain. I read every one of these. If you want grounded health and weather coverage built on the actual published science, instead of recycled panic, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach the people who genuinely need to understand this before the next heat wave hits. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. To understand why a heat wave's death toll keeps rising after the temperature itself has already dropped, you first have to understand what extreme heat actually does to the human body while it is happening, because the damage is rarely a single dramatic event. When core body temperature climbs, the heart has to work significantly harder to pump blood toward the skin in an attempt to release that heat, while simultaneously losing large volumes of fluid and electrolytes through sweat, which thickens the blood and raises the risk of clot formation. The kidneys, meanwhile, are forced to filter blood that is more concentrated and under more strain than usual, while receiving less blood flow overall because so much of it has been redirected toward the skin. None of this is necessarily fatal on its own, and for a healthy adult, it usually is not. But for someone whose heart, kidneys, or blood vessels were already operating close to their limit before the heat wave even began, that extra several days of sustained physiological strain can be the exact push that tips an existing, manageable condition into a full medical emergency. And critically, that emergency does not always arrive while the thermometer is still climbing. This is precisely the pattern researchers keep finding when they look closely at the data instead of only counting deaths that occur on the hottest days themselves. A 2026 study out of Senegal, examining hospital admissions in the Matam region using several years of climate and hospital records, found a statistically significant delayed effect, with hospitalizations peaking 3 to 5 days after a heat wave event had already ended, not during it. A separate systematic review of dozens of published studies on heat and cardiovascular health found that researchers most commonly needed to look at lag windows of 3, 14, or as long as 21 days after a heat exposure to properly capture its full impact on hospital admissions, because a meaningful share of the cardiovascular events a heat wave ultimately causes simply had not happened yet by the time the heat wave itself was declared over. And in perhaps the most striking example, a recent study examining heat waves and annual mortality among Americans aged 65 and older specifically built its methodology around capturing delayed effects for 3 to 5 months after a heat wave occurred. Because the researchers found that using only same-day or same-week death counts, the standard most public heat wave death tolls are built on missed a substantial portion of the actual mortality burden entirely. The gap between what gets counted and what actually happens is not a new problem. And looking at how badly it has undercounted heat deaths in past years helps explain why researchers are so confident this summer's official numbers will eventually be revised upward too. When the Associated Press analyzed death certificate data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, covering the summer of 2023, it found more than 2,300 deaths, where a medical examiner had specifically noted the effects of excessive heat, the highest total in 45 years of record keeping at the time. And more than 24 doctors, public health researchers, and meteorologists interviewed for that same analysis were blunt in saying that even that record-setting number was almost certainly just a fraction of the real toll, because heat rarely appears as the sole listed cause of death on a certificate. It shows up instead as a heart attack, a stroke, or kidney failure, exactly the outcomes the delayed effect research keeps identifying, with the heat wave that actually triggered the chain of events weeks earlier left completely unmentioned in the paperwork. This is not a case of officials deliberately hiding numbers. It is a structural gap in how death is recorded in the first place, one that consistently favors undercounting heat's true toll over overcounting it. There is a second layer to this problem that compounds the first one, and it is specifically relevant to the summer North America has just lived through. A 2025 study published in PLOS Climate, examining regional mortality trends across the United States from 1981 through 2022, found that the number of extreme heat days a region experiences, not simply how high the peak temperature reaches during any single day, is the single strongest predictor of heat-related mortality. The researchers behind that finding explained the mechanism plainly. Duration matters more than intensity because the physiological recovery time available between heat exposures is what ultimately determines whether the cumulative strain on a person's body reaches a fatal threshold. In other words, a single scorching afternoon followed by several cooler days to recover is measurably less dangerous than a lower peak temperature repeated wave after wave with no real recovery window in between, because the body's cardiovascular and kidney systems never get the chance to reset before the next round of strain arrives. That finding matters enormously for this specific summer because this has not been a single heat wave story, it has been a sequence of them. The first heat dome settled over the eastern United States and eastern Canada from the 28th of June through the 5th of July, producing the bulk of this summer's officially confirmed 44 deaths, 29 in New Jersey, 7 in Pennsylvania, 4 in Illinois, 3 in New York, and 1 in Mississippi. Severe thunderstorms finally broke that heat dome between the 4th and 6th of July, but even that transition came at a cost, with those same storms causing more than 1.3 million power outages and 4 additional deaths, along with what is believed Connecticut. Barely a day after that first heat dome cleared out, a second one had already begun forming across the western and central United States, and by the 15th of July, record heat had returned to the East Coast as well, with Lehigh Valley International Airport, tying its daily temperature record at 98 degrees. Billings, Montana came within a single degree of matching an all-time heat record that had stood since 1901. According to the exact mechanism the PLOS climate researchers described, that back-to-back, wave after wave pattern, with barely any true recovery window between episodes, is precisely the scenario most likely to produce a delayed mortality toll significantly larger than the number attached to any single heat dome counted in isolation. This is also why the researchers who study this pattern describe themselves as genuinely worried rather than simply cautious, because the compounding problem does not appear to be a temporary feature of one unusual summer. A major climate modeling study published by researchers at the University of Melbourne examined what happens to heat waves under a range of future emission scenarios, including ones where the world successfully reaches net zero carbon emissions by the middle of this century. Their conclusion was stark. Even under a successful net zero pathway, heat waves are projected to continue intensifying, growing hotter, longer, and more frequent, for as long as 1,000 years into the future, because of the sheer amount of heat already locked into the ocean and atmosphere system that will take centuries to fully equilibrate. The same research found that every additional year of delay in reaching net zero measurably worsens how extreme future heat waves become, with the effect most pronounced for regions closer to the equator. Layer that finding on top of the delayed mortality research, and the picture that emerges is not one where a single bad summer produces a one-time spike in hidden deaths that eventually gets corrected. It is one where the underlying driver, longer and more frequent heat waves with less recovery time between them, is expected to keep intensifying for generations, meaning the gap between official heat death counts and the true toll is a problem that is very likely to widen rather than close on its own. There's also a slower, quieter version of this same delayed effect worth understanding because it extends the timeline even further than most people would expect. Research into long-term outcomes among patients who survived a heat stroke event has found an association between that history and an elevated risk of cardiovascular disease well after full physical recovery, including conditions like ischemic heart disease, heart failure, and atrial fibrillation showing up months or years later. Researchers studying this outcome have been candid that this remains an understudied area precisely because so few health systems track a patient's heat exposure history the same way they track other major risk factors, meaning a heart condition that emerges a year after a severe heat event is rarely, if ever, connected back to that heat event in the medical record, let alone in a public death toll. That gap is a large part of why public health researchers increasingly describe official heat wave death counts not as an inflated worst-case estimate, but as closer to a floor, the minimum confirmed number, sitting beneath a true total that current record-keeping practices are simply not built to fully capture. Who actually ends up inside these delayed statistics is not random either, and understanding that pattern is part of why researchers describe this as a solvable problem rather than an unavoidable one. The same body of research consistently points to a specific overlapping set of risk factors: older adults, people with pre-existing heart or kidney disease, people taking certain common medications for blood pressure or mental health conditions that interfere with the body's ability to regulate its own temperature, and people without reliable access to air conditioning during both the heat wave itself and the days immediately following it. That last factor matters more than it might initially seem, because someone who spent the peak of a heat dome in an air-conditioned space but then loses power, or cannot afford to keep running an air conditioner, during the several days afterward when their cardiovascular system is still under elevated strain, is, according to this research, still very much inside the window of highest risk, even though the outside temperature may have already dropped back to a seemingly ordinary summer reading. That is part of why public health researchers have increasingly pushed for cooling centers and utility assistance programs to remain active for several days after a heat advisory technically expires, rather than closing the moment the National Weather Service lifts its warning. A policy shift directly informed by exactly the delayed effect data this video has been walking through. So what does all of this actually mean for you, whether you personally experienced one of this summer's heat domes directly or are watching from somewhere? The heat itself never reached triple digits. The practical lesson from this research is not that a heat wave becomes safe to ignore the moment the temperature drops and the advisory expires. It is closer to the opposite. The days immediately following a heat wave, precisely when most people relax and assume the danger has passed, are, according to the delayed effect research, one of the more medically significant windows of the entire event, particularly for anyone with an existing heart, kidney, or blood pressure condition, or anyone who is elderly. Continuing to monitor for symptoms like unusual fatigue, chest discomfort, confusion, or swelling for several days after a heat wave ends, rather than treating cooler weather as an automatic all clear, is a direct, practical response to exactly the mechanism this research describes. And for anyone who has lived through more than one heat wave this summer already, without much of a real break in between, the science suggests that cumulative strain is a genuine factor in its own right, not simply a matter of having survived each individual event. Researchers working in this specific area have also pointed to a more basic obstacle behind why this gap persists year after year, which is that most public health surveillance systems were originally built around tracking acute, same-day events, the kind of statistic that fits cleanly into a daily news cycle, rather than the slower, distributed pattern that delayed mortality data actually describes. Building the kind of long-term cross-reference tracking system capable of properly linking a heart attack in September back to a heat wave in July requires sustained investment in exactly the kind of unglamorous epidemiological infrastructure that rarely attracts attention until a study like the ones covered in this video forces the issue back into view. The honest, grounded summary is this: the 44 deaths officially attributed to this summer's North American heat waves reflect only the portion of the toll that current record-keeping is actually built to capture, deaths that occurred on or immediately around the hottest days themselves. Published research on heat and cardiovascular health consistently finds that a meaningful share of heat-related hospitalizations and deaths occur 3 to 5 days after a heat wave ends, that properly capturing the full health impact often requires researchers to look out 14 to 21 days or longer, and that at least one major American study found delayed mortality effects extending 3 to 5 months beyond the heat wave itself. That undercounting pattern is not new, with the Associated Press finding that even a record-setting 2,300 deaths attributed to heat in 2023 was, according to the researchers who study this, still likely only a fraction of the real total. This summer compounded that risk further by delivering back-to-back heat domes with limited recovery time between them, precisely the pattern a 2025 study identified as the strongest predictor of heat mortality, ahead of peak temperature itself. In research modeling, the centuries ahead finds that even a successful global transition to net zero emissions will not reverse the trend of longer, more frequent heat waves for up to 1,000 years, meaning the gap between what official heat death counts report and what is actually happening inside the bodies of the people who lived through them is a problem researchers expect to keep growing, not one this particular summer will resolve on its own. We are going to keep tracking this exactly the way we tracked it today, straight from the published research, the hospital data, and the researchers actually studying how heat moves through the human body over days, weeks, and months, not the headline number alone. Subscribe so you do not miss what the revised toll from this summer's heat domes eventually looks like once the delayed data catches up. Because based on everything we just walked through, the Headlines reported in early July was very likely just the beginning of the count, not the end of it. And leave that comment below. Tell me whether the place you live has gone through more than one heat wave this summer with barely any real break in between, because according to the research we just covered, that pattern specifically is the one carrying the greatest hidden risk. Because behind every one of these numbers is a person who felt fine the day the heat broke, who went back to their normal routine assuming the danger had passed with the temperature, and whose body, quietly and without warning, was still paying down a debt the heat wave had left behind. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.